Good morning, everybody. My name is Andrew, and I'm working with Cyclone-e-bikes here in Taichung today. And we're going to introduce the Nikita electric motorbike and show you how you will receive it and then how to put it together after it arrives at your home. So what we have here are the components that will come in one box, and then of course the frame that will come in a second box. So again, that's two boxes, and after you receive the two, you will need to assemble all of these components onto this frame. All right, so let me introduce the different parts as well as the tools that you will need. Starting with the tools, you don't need everything that you see here. We have all of these because it makes it convenient. We have two different sizes of ratchets. We have a three-way Allen key as well as a set of Allen keys and then a full set of open end wrenches. So like I said, you don't need all of these, and as we assemble the bike, you'll see what we use. As for the components, let me introduce them to you one by one. This is the charger. This is a 5-amp charger. This is the seat. This is the beam that will hold the seat on the back of the bike. This is your front mudguard, suspension fork, handlebars with the display and the clamp and the hardware. This is the front brake as well as the mirrors and the brake cable, kickstand, rear mudguard, and then some side covers. You can see the little pieces of hardware are next to each of the components. There's 4 short bolts here, 4 more there, 2 bolts there, and 4 bolts here to hold the front mudguard on. Starting with the front fork, we have the lower crown, the 2 legs, the upper crown, the upper bearing. The lower bearing is already here. We have the lock nut and the washer. Inside the head tube, there's already 2 bearing races. Those will already be installed when you receive the bike. One tool we forgot to show at the beginning is just a crescent wrench or an adjustable wrench that can be used to tighten the lock nut once the crown is on the bike. All right, so as you're installing the fork, remember to put the brake lever through the 2 legs of the fork before that top crown goes on. I'm going to put my top bearing into the upper part of the head tube, and I have my upper crown ready once I get the fork inside the frame. Okay, so lean it back a bit, sliding up through. All right, seating the lower bearing. Okay, now I need to hold the fork in place while I slide on the upper crown, giving a little gentle encouragement on both sides until it's pretty well seated. Okay, now probably I could let go at this point, but it'd be a bad idea. It might fall out. So I'm going to keep holding it until I have first my washer and then my lock nut on top. Okay, so at this point the fork cannot fall out and I can finish adjusting the nut on top. So I'll go by hand at first. Again, I might tap my crown to make sure it's sliding down onto the legs. Okay, and then I will tighten it a bit. So this is an adjustment. It's not a fastener that should just be tightened down hard. Really, we're setting the preload on the bearings. So this is something you want to feel. It's not that hard. If the fork starts to bind too much, then you're obviously too tight. If it's very loose, then obviously you may want to loosen the nut a bit. So I feel like it's a little bit tight, so I'm going to back it off a very small amount. A little too much. Okay, that feels pretty good. Now, after you ride the bike the first time, you may detect some looseness and you can always come back and readjust it if you need to. Okay, very important, after we have the top tightened, we need to lock the upper crown onto the legs. These look like maybe 12mm fasteners. So I'm going to use this ratchet wrench because it's convenient. Of course, you could use open-end wrenches. Okay, I'm wrong. It's a 13mm ratchet. Again, these are not fasteners you're going to tighten down really hard, tighter than this nut, but you're not trying to crush the legs of the fork. You want this to be quite snug, but not super, super tight. Using a small wrench like this is one way to avoid over-tightening those. Okay, so again, those are snug, but they are not locked down with all the force of my hands. Next component we're going to install will be the handlebars. All right, here we have our handlebars. The handlebars only have two components. They have the display already mounted, as well as the throttle. Both of those have their own wire harness. Okay, and to install the handlebar, quite simple and quite obvious. There are 4 bolts, which match with 2 handlebar clamps. On the handlebar, there's 2 knurled sections here and here. It'll be quite obvious that they align with the clamps on the handlebar, or on the fork crown here. Okay, so right now the position of the bars doesn't matter. We can adjust it later. I'm putting in my 4 bolts with my 2 clamps. The handlebars are in this lower rotated position, and when the handlebars are tight, we're going to need them to be up like this. So this is something that will be a personal preference and something you can adjust more once the seat is on the bike and you're sitting on the bike, and you can move your handlebars to where you like them. For now, we're going to put them in a fairly neutral position with the rise of the bars more or less aligned with the rise of the angle of the fork. Okay, so we'll start tightening. These 4 bolts need to be tightened quite equally, so you cannot just tighten down one while forgetting about the other. These split clamps are going to have a gap between the upper part and the lower part, and the gaps on either side, maybe you can see it here and here, need to be equal when this is all said and done. And that will happen by tightening equally as you go. So I'm actually going to loosen this side a bit because I feel like I've over-tightened it, and this side will need to now catch up and align with it, or be equal with it. Okay, so just like the fork crown, we don't want to over-tighten these bolts. They need to be quite snug, but they should not be. You should not get a big wrench and put a huge amount of force on them. Once again, a small wrench is sometimes a good way to avoid over-tightening. Okay. One side looks good, the other side we're still going. Okay, so those are both tight. Again, we could come back and adjust them again later if need be. If I didn't show it before our handlebar, or before our camera turned off, I've loosened using a 3mm Allen key. I've loosened both of these bolts in order to move the display out of the way while tightening the clamps. Now I'm going to bring it back and retighten these clamps. Now these ones are really important not to over tighten. You can definitely break these clamps, these handlebar clamps, if you over tighten them. So once again, snug but not too tight. Okay, so there we have it. Handlebar clamp, 4 bolts are tight. Our display is back in position. Okay, up next, we will bring the rear brake lever forward and put it on the handlebar. There's a second half of the clamp, which is here. Okay. So the other half of the clamp has the mirror already installed on it. There's 2 bolts that are going to make up the other part of the split clamp, very similar to what we just did. Okay, so we start by tightening these bolts just by hand, get the threads started, and then do all our adjustment after that. Okay, make sure not to cross thread your threads. Make sure they align pretty well before you start tightening them. Okay, so if they're going in smoothly by hand, then you know that your threads are aligned. So I'm using this tri-Allen because it's convenient, but of course you can use a standard Allen key as well. These are 5mm bolts, and at risk of repeating myself, this is a split clamp. You need to tighten the bolts on both sides equally. So I've over tightened one side, I'm loosening it off and tightening the other side. And once again, do not over tighten the bolts, just snug enough to hold the brake lever onto the handlebar. The position of the brake lever is really up to you. More or less, the end of the brake lever will align with the end of the handlebar, but it's another one of these things you can adjust to your preference, and you can do it after you have the rest of the bike assembled and you are sitting on it, and you can feel where you want the levers in relation to your hands. Okay, that's the rear brake lever. Now we'll do the front. With the front, we have the lever and the caliper. Neither one is installed, unlike the rear where the caliper is already installed on the rear wheel. We're going to start with the lever for the handlebar. So gently put the caliper down on the ground. Again, 2 bolts, very much like the other brake lever. The only difference is that on this side we have 8mm cap screws, or hex cap screws. And once again, you can move these components where you like them to make your hands comfortable. For now, we'll install this on the inside of the selector. The selector is connected to the display. If you want to move the selector, move the brake lever, again, you can do all of that later on to your preference. So this is, again, identical to the rear lever, the only difference being that now we need to use an 8mm socket. Okay, 8mm socket. Making them equal and snug but not too tight. All right, so our handlebars are basically set up. We can do final adjustment later, but that's where we need to be for the time being. Let's take a look at our caliper. Okay, the caliper has 2 bolts. Each bolt has a washer on it. Caliper is going to come around to the back side of the fork, and of course a disc is going to fit in between these pads. So you can imagine visually that those pads need to be on the inside of the fork. Not out here, not this way, not this way, this way. The washers go on the outside, starting by hand. It's my upper bolt. And here is my lower bolt. By hand. These are going to be 6mm Allen key heads. And I'll say it again, snug but not too tight. Now these should be pretty tight. You should put some good torque on these, but you don't have to go completely crazy. All right, and that's it. All right, so the next part we're going to install is the front wheel. To do that, we have lifted the bike up, as you can tell, so we'll have enough space between the ground and the tire in order to put the wheel inside. We'll start by getting our wires out of the way. We don't want to damage those, and we'll plug them in later. This is the front axle. The front axle has 2 spacers. It has a large diameter, shorter spacer, and a smaller diameter, longer spacer. This big one will go on the same side as the rotor, the brake rotor, and this will obviously go on the other side. Okay. So we'll need to take both of them off. Okay, so we can get our axle started, starting from the side with the brake caliper. All right, slide our front wheel in. Now the spacer will need to go in at the same time that the wheel comes up, and the rotor needs to go inside of the caliper. So we got to make sure our brake pads are spaced apart. Note, you don't want to pull the brake lever while there is no rotor inside the brake. Otherwise, the brake pads will be pushed together and you'll end up using a screwdriver or something to pry the brake pads open again. So don't pull the lever right now. I have enough space for my rotor to slide in, so I can line it up, lift it in. Okay. This will be a little bit tricky. I have my spacer here at the same time. I'm going to slide that in, hold the wheel in place, and advance the axle forward. Okay. I wish I could show it to you better, but I think you get the idea of what I'm doing. Okay, as the axle comes through on the other side, we're going to need to get our other spacer on there. This will rotate. This is the leg of the fork, so you can give yourself plenty of space. I'll bring my axle through a little bit farther to hold my spacer. Okay, now I'm going to rotate the leg back and continue pushing my axle. Pushing my axle through. Okay, so this is going to take a little bit of finagling, but not too bad. All right, we're through. And the last thing I have to do is put my nut on this side. Now when we're tightening the nut, we may need to hold, I think we do need to hold, this is a nylock nut, so we need to hold one side with I think is a 19 millimeter, let's check, and we'll need to tighten the other side with another 19 millimeter. Checking, I'm wrong again, I think it's a 17. Okay, this is a 19, and the head of the bolt, or the head of the axle is a 17 millimeter. So I'm holding the 17 and I'm going to rotate this side with my ratchet. Okay. Getting close. All right. So firm but not too tight. Good. We can test our brake lever, make sure that the caliper is clamping on the rotor, feels good. You can check the rear too because it's already in place. Both brake levers feel pretty good. All right, so the front end is installed and we'll move to the next component. Next component we're going to do is the wiring. In this case, it's very easy. We really have just a throttle and our LCD display. So let's get our wires unwrapped or untangled here. Okay. Okay, making sure I get all the twists out. All right, so on the throttle side, we're going to have two wires. One is a 3-wire and the other is 2-wire. So the only side we actually are going to use is our black, green, red 3-wire side. And similarly on the display, there's a 2-wire connector as well as a 5-wire connector. And we're going to only use the 5 wires. Okay. So we can sort of handle them together. They're going to come through the crown of the fork or through the legs of the fork. And they're headed inside the frame through this gap. So I will make a little loop, fish it in there, and then pull it through gently. I don't want to yank on it if the connectors get stuck. All right, so now we have 2 wires, and inside we're going to look for their connectors. So what we have is one that says throttle on it, and that will obviously be for the throttle. And then we have another one that says S900, and that's for the display. And it's pretty straightforward. You cannot plug these in the wrong way, as in this would be the wrong way, but this connector, oh, that's the right, yeah, this is the wrong way. You cannot put the connector together the wrong way. You have to flip it over and then it will snap in. And you'll hear a snap when it is properly connected. Our throttle is here. And remember, we're using the 3-wire and it only goes one way and it snaps together. And that's it. The extra wire can just be fed down inside the frame. And that's complete. All right, here's our next part. We're going to call this our seat beam. Maybe you have a better term for it. If it's not obvious, this is what will hold the seat, which we'll install later. Okay, so on the top here are 2 bolts, which we will remove. Okay, and we're just going to lay this down here gently. Nothing too fragile, but we don't need to smash anything either. And we will get our bolts at least started through these eye bolts. Okay, there's one. And again, don't cross thread. Get things aligned, move it around a bit, and make sure that it goes in nicely before you start threading it down. Okay, so those aren't tight yet. They're just holding it in place. Now our lower part, probably should have taken the nuts off first, but no big deal. We got 2 bolts, 1 and 2. All right, so we have the wires here. The wires are going to go on the inside of the beam, and we'll get the 2 sides just roughly aligned and try to get our first bolt in. A little bit of tapping, coax it to line up. Looks pretty good. Let's give it a try. Okay, there's our first bolt. Okay, I'm not going to worry about the nut yet. I'll get the other side installed first. Tapping. Almost there. you have a rubber mallet, it'd probably be a good place to use it, but we'll just try to be quick. Ouch. Oops. Okay, I think we're aligned now. Almost aligned, a little too far. One more. Very close. Very close. Come on. All right. It's being a bit frustrating, but we're going in. I'm actually turning it so it just to kind of use the threads to drive it in there. Again, if you had a rubber mallet, you could just tap things gently and they would go together. Let's see if I can get this. Okay. I'm going to use my ratchet wrench gently to tap it if I can. All right, so that was a little improvisation, but did the job. If you are going to tap things, like I said, tap them gently. If it's not lined up, then don't use a big hammer and hammer on it really hard. I was using that because it was already very close to aligned, and tapping it was just the final way to get it to go through. Okay, so I've started both of the nuts. Okay, so those nuts, I think, are 10 millimeter. 10 millimeter nuts, maybe 12. I'll bring my 12 with me. 13 is what I'm hearing. My estimation is way off today. All right, so 13. I hold it in place, and then I'm tightening from the outside with my 6 millimeter Allen key. Okay, snug, not too tight. And the same on the other side. Snug, but not too tight. All right, now let's remember we haven't actually tightened these on the top here. We were waiting until the other parts were in place. So now we can come back, again, 6 millimeter. And we're going to come down on those, snug and snug. Now, you could use these eye bolts. They're here so you can adjust the angle of your seat a little bit. It's probably in the right place, but technically if you wanted to adjust that as a rider, you could use these eye bolts to raise and lower the seat a small amount. The next component we're going to install is the seat onto what we're calling the seat beam. So on the bottom of the seat there's a hook, and then there are two sort of attachment bolting tabs here on the back. Now I've already taken them out and they're down there. There's going to be a bolt here and a bolt here, and we will use those, of course, to attach here at the tabs. So step one, we're going to bring this down. You can kind of look underneath and get that hook aligned. Then we're going to push down a bit and get it to slide on like that. And then we will pull back until these line up like that. Here's my little bolts. Pretty obvious what to do with them. There's one and two. They both have washers on them to help cover the slots in the seat. Okay. Try Allen. These are 4 millimeter. Snug but not too tight. And that's it. That's what secures the seat. Okay, up next, this is the rear mudguard. Rear mudguard has a little hook on it here. That hook will match a hook on the bottom of the saddle. So I'm going to reach under here, find that hook, and slide them together. And then I will be aligning 2 holes and using 2 bolts, each with a 13mm nut. Sorry about that. Bolt is going through, nut is on the bottom. I think what I want to do is turn the nut from the top while I hold the nut, turn the bolts while I hold the nut on the bottom. Okay, it's working well. Not too tight. And good. Not too tight. And we're done. Great, looking good. We are now going to install 2 side covers, one on either side, here and here. We have 4 bolts and a pretty straightforward installation procedure. Okay, 1, 2. One and 2. Sorry, struggling to align a little bit here. That's my fault. There we go. Almost. All right, good. Snug those down. 5mm Allen key. Okay. All right, and those are our side panels. All right, at this point we're going to move back to the front of the bike, and we have only a few pieces left. These are some guards for the lower part of the fork, and then we'll be putting the mud guard on after that. 4 bolts, 4 holes, 2 guards. Okay, so these are a little bit different depending on the side they're going on. So the long side here will be on the outside on their respective sides. Inside here there's a bit of a channel which aligns with a part on the white clamp here on the fork. So we're going to align that channel, and then we're going to slide it all the way down until the 2 bolt holes are aligned at the front here. These are 5mm bolts. I should say the heads are 5mm Allen keys. Oops. Sorry, I'm sliding around too much here. All right, there's 1 and 2. Okay, simple. And the same thing on the other side. The channel lined up. Okay, so what I'm seeing on this side is that the white clamp is a little bit out of position. It's no problem, I just need to rotate it. And I'll be tightening that white clamp afterwards, after everything is lined up. Okay, get the lower part lined up. My 2 bolts. Okay, my convenient wrench is a little bit too big in this case, so I'll go back to a traditional Allen key. Sorry, I'm struggling with the alignment a little bit here. There we go. Okay, my own fault for not getting it lined up to begin with. Make sure you get the plastic in the right place before you try putting in the bolts. Okay, so these bolts are going into aluminum on the fork, and whenever you're putting something like a steel bolt into aluminum, you're going to be conscious that the aluminum is a little bit soft, and you don't want to misalign the bolt and then damage the threads. All right, so these as again should be tight, snug, but not too tight. Again, you don't want to pull the threads out of the aluminum fork. Okay, so snug, snug. And as we noted before, up here, these white clamps are actually not tightened yet. So now that the guards are in place, we should tighten them up. I'm noticing that the brake line should go on the inside of the guard there. There's a little place for it. And those look like 13 millimeter bolts. Let's see. I got everything wrong today. These are 10 millimeter bolts. Goodness. Snug these up. You might need to put a 10 millimeter wrench on the outside to keep the bolt from turning while you tighten the nut. In my case, the head of the nut is staying in place okay. Doesn't seem to need that. All right. Okay, we're back, and correction. We had the correct bolts. We were just missing the washers that need to go with the bolts. Okay, pretty simple. 4 holes, 4 bolts. We'll just get them started by hand, one at a time. There's one. Of course, with the washer, it's important. There's 2. 3. And 4. Okay, those are 4 millimeter Allen bolts. Okay. Snugging them up. All right, and our front mudguard is installed. So we're very close. We have 1 bolt left, and that is for the rear, not for the rear, for the kickstand. On top here we have a 6 millimeter, by which of course I mean an 8 millimeter. No, I don't, I mean 6 millimeter. 6 millimeter bolt. And back here, where it's a little bit hard to see, but it's quite obvious when you're here, there's a little bracket that is for the kickstand. Being so close to this garage door is making it a little bit challenging to get in here, but we can do it. All right, making this quite tight. And there we have it. There is a complete Cyclone Nikita motorbike, 2300 watt off-road dirt bike.